My guest today is Dr. Efraim Zuroff. Dr. Zuroff is a Holocaust historian who serves as the chief Nazi hunter at the Simon Wiesenthal Center, a Jewish human rights organization based in Los Angeles. Dr. Zuroff himself is based in Jerusalem and is the director of the center's office there. He was also the author of the book Operation Last Chance, One Man's Quest to Bring Nazi Criminals to Justice, and has written hundreds of articles relating to the Holocaust and has appeared in several documentaries about hunting Nazis. In recognition of his efforts, he was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. Dr. Zuroff, thank you for joining us. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, and thank you for inviting me.
Oh, thank you for coming. So Nazi hunting, I think many would think is quite an extraordinary, weird, interesting, fascinating job. How did you get into this field?
Oh, God. Listen, long story. Unlike many people, many of whom actually approach me after lectures about my life as a Nazi hunter, and they tell me how growing up, that was their fantasy, to go be a Nazi hunter so they could, catch the Nazis, torture them, kill them, things of that sort. But the irony of the story is that was never my fantasy growing up in Brooklyn. My fantasy was to be the first Orthodox Jew to play in the NBA. Now, that proved to be a problem for two reasons. First of all, you can't really be an Orthodox Jew and observe an Orthodox Jew and play in the NBA. But there was this other little problem about not being good enough to play in the NBA. So I had to modify my fantasy. And as I say, that basketball's loss is Nazi hunting's gain. But to briefly explain, I was very active politically on behalf of Jewish causes, Israel, Soviet Jewry, Ethiopian Jewry, Syrian Jewry, in college, actually starting even in high school on behalf of Soviet Jewry, and later very involved in the university. And my favorite area of interest was history, especially Jewish history. So when I went to Israel to do as a graduate student, and I had to choose a specialization in what we call contemporary Jewry, basically history, sociology of the Jewish people in the 20th century, I chose the Holocaust because I realized when I got to Israel that there was absolutely nothing practical about the studies at Hebrew U. And I figured if I going to be there, what I thought was going to be 3 years and ended up 5 years, I may as well devote the time and the effort to the subject that intrigued me intellectually the most, which really was, how was the Holocaust possible? And I had very specific questions about about my own community, what was known in the United States while the Holocaust was taking place. What did they know? When did they know? How did they react? And I ultimately wrote a PhD thesis on the activities of the Vadat Sela Rescue Committee. It's a rescue committee of rabbis, Orthodox rabbis, which was set up initially to save only rabbis and yeshiva students, but ultimately expanded its activities to try and save any Jew who was in danger. Then I went to work at Yad Vashem, and during that time, I became even much more involved in the issue of the Holocaust. And when I went to Los Angeles, I went to America for 2 years after my aliyah, 8 years after my aliyah, to collect material to finish my thesis, to write the thesis. I met Simon Wiesenthal. I worked at the Simon Wiesenthal Center. I met Simon Wiesenthal. The Americans were starting to prosecute. And I got much more involved in the whole issue of the efforts to bring Nazis to justice, because I had never read the books by Wiesenthal. He wasn't my hero or anything like that. But in a sense, it was a good combination of activism in the area that I was intellectually interested in. So it was a good combination. And in any event, I didn't want to sit in some ivory tower and become a professor or anything like that. It was a perfect fit for me, really, I have to say. and I don't regret
Yeah.
it. And I feel privileged to have spent the last more than 40 years trying to facilitate the justice, bringing Nazi war criminals to justice.
So what was your first case, so to speak? So you talk about the PhD, you talk about working at the center. How does this then translate into, okay, you're now assigned to tracking down a Nazi?
Okay, listen, I have to tell you a story that will explain how I made the switch from graduate student to Holocaust, to Nazi hunter. When I returned to Israel, I came with a contract to serve as a researcher for the Office of Special Investigations, the United States Department of Justice, which was the office which was entrusted with the task of prosecuting Nazi war criminals who were living in America. And I was working for them for 6 years. And in the 6th year, I received an assignment to try and find a survivor of the Lodz ghetto who had been deported to Auschwitz in September of 44, had been sent to work in Mengele's clinic, Joseph Mengele's clinic, and he had written a letter to a counterintelligence. No, he was the source of information that the American army had arrested and released Joseph Mengele near Vienna in late 1946. And this letter was obtained by the Simon Wiesenthal Center. They made a whole scandal out of the fact that Mengele had apparently been arrested and released by the Americans. And the American government, in response, William French Smith, who was the Attorney General, made 3 decisions. One is that the United States of America will physically look for Joseph Mengele. This is 1986. Mengele had disappeared into thin air. No one knew where he was. He had never been brought to trial. So the Americans will look for him. The Americans will also investigate whether he might have entered the United States, because by this time the Americans knew that thousands of Nazi war criminals had entered the United States illegally. And third, there was an investigation to determine whether or not this information was actually true. And that investigation was entrusted to the Office of Special Investigations, where I worked. And my assignment was to find David Freiman. He was the informant who had written, in other words, the basis for the letter that the U.S. Army officer wrote to his superior, indicating that Mengele had been arrested and released. So in any event, I had no idea how to find the guy. It's already 41 years after the end of the war. Where do you look for him? So David Silberklang, who was working at Yad Vashem, and to this day is working at Yad Vashem, and he was also a student of my father's, he suggested I look in the files of the International Tracing Service, which was established after World War II to help people find or get information about the fate of their relatives. So in other words, the Red Cross was flooded with requests for information. And in those days, there were no databases. So they had a collection of index cards of over 16 million index cards. That doesn't mean it's 16 million people, because some people had more than one card. But in any event, they were organized and they were put on microfilm. And unlike the situation in other countries that had this information, because it was owned by 11 different countries, in Israel, the information was accessible to anybody. And it's very interesting, because if you had written to Germany, the sources, the originals were in Germany, in a place called Arelsen. And this is sometimes referred to as the Arelsen collection. You would not get an answer unless you were asking about a first-degree relative. In other words, if I wrote to them on behalf, as a researcher for the Office of Special Investigations, they wouldn't have responded. But for some reason, which unknown to me to this very day, Israel allowed full access to anyone, any researcher certainly, who wanted to see the information. So in any event, I went looking for David Freiman. And the luckiest thing that happened to me was that the material was organized not according to the regular alphabet. It was organized according to a phonetic alphabet, which means that double letters count as one. V and W are the same letter for them, and I, J, and Y are the same letter. So it took me about an hour to get the hang of it. But during that hour, I realized something absolutely fascinating, which was that many of the people who were listed there were actually Nazi war criminals. In other words, I originally thought that the information in the Arelson collection was only about Jews, but I found out that there were millions of non-Jews who were listed there. And although there was no indication on the cards whether any of these people were Nazi war criminals, Nazi collaborators, I knew from my research for the Justice Department that the Nazi war criminals or collaborators who came to the Anglo-Saxon countries had all initially been in displaced persons camps in Germany, primarily in Germany and Austria, and they're also in Austria. And they had emigrated posing as innocent refugees. So I had my own sources about these people, and I made an experiment. I took the names of 49 Lithuanians and Latvians whom I knew were Nazi war criminals, and within a matter of minutes, I was able to find their immigration destinations. Now, why was this important? Because at that time, the only Anglo-Saxon country which admitted Nazi war criminals, but had already decided to take legal action against them, was the United States. And I was working for the office that was doing it. But Canada was investigating, Australia was investigating, UK and New Zealand ostensibly had no idea that they had a problem. Now, if you're wondering about South Africa, South Africa was at that point hermetically closed to immigration, so the Nazis didn't go there. Okay? Now, so I realized that this was a tool, this Arelson collection was a tool to get the 4 other countries who had admitted Nazis to take legal action. In other words, and the best way to do it would be to flood them with the names of the suspects. So I contacted Rabbi Haya, who's the founder and director and the head of the Wiesenthal Center. And I said to him, listen, you still don't have an office in Jerusalem. I worked for them for 2 years in LA. Let's open an office in Jerusalem. I can send you the names of, I mean, I had no idea what the extent of it was, of tens, hundreds of names. And we'll flood these countries with these names in order to ensure that they won't simply walk away from the problem and say, you know, there's hardly any cases, it's a minor issue. We have to convince them that they have to take legal action. And Rabbi Haya agreed. To his credit, he agreed immediately. And I remember the first list was of 40, mostly Lithuanians and Latvians who went to Australia. It was given to Bob Hayden. It was Bill Hayden or Bob Hayden, the Australian foreign minister at the UN, when he visited the UN in 1986 on October 1st. The second list was for the UK. It was a list of 17 Lithuanians and Latvians who we suspected had gone to Great Britain, were living in Great Britain. And that's what began the whole issue of Nazi war criminals in Great Britain. And eventually I submitted almost, I think it's more than 3,000 names to the different governments. And the good news is that Canada in 1987, Australia in 1989, and Great Britain in 1991 all passed special laws to enable criminal prosecution of Nazi war criminals in those countries. The only country that refused was New Zealand, which I think is an absolute travesty of justice and absurd. But the only thing I can say is that in New Zealand, there were far less cases than there were, for example, in Australia or Canada or Great Britain.
Why did they refuse?
They refused because there was no political will to take action against them. But, I mean, we had an uphill battle. In the UK, it took us 5 years, almost 5 years, to convince them. The first list was submitted on October 22nd. 1986, to the British consul Donald Ballantyne in Los Angeles. And in the end, we only got the bill passed. The bill was only passed in June of 1991 because Queen Elizabeth overrode the veto of the House of Lords. In other words, it passed the House of Commons initially, that Lords rejected it. Passed the House of Commons again, the Lords rejected it. Passed the House of Commons a third time, and Queen Elizabeth, for the first time in 70 years, signed it into law over the rejections, the double rejection of the House of Lords.
Wow.
So we made history. I mean, this I think is certainly one of the major accomplishments that I can be proud of, in the course of my career.
Absolutely. And of all the cases you've had, you've previously said that another one of the highlights of your career was the prosecution of a man called Dinko Shakic. And I'm wondering, could you tell the listeners who is Dinko Shakic and why does this case stand out for you?
Dinko Shakic was the last living concentration camp commander, and he was the commander for a relatively brief period of the worst concentration camp in the Balkans, a camp called Jasenovac, which was established by the independent state of Croatia, and to which thousands and thousands of Serbs, Jews, and Roma were deported, and tens of thousands of them were murdered. Mostly Serbs. The largest number of victims were Serbs, then Jews, then Roma, and it was a terrible, terrible place, horrific cruelty of the guards, horrible tortures and executions, and efforts to do everything possible to make the lives, initially the lives and later the murders of these poor victims as painful and as horrific as possible. So he had run away to Argentina because I don't know if many of our listeners probably understand or they are aware of what they call the rat lines, the escape networks of the Nazi war criminals. And this project to save the Nazi war criminals was run by an Austrian bishop named Alois Hudel, who ran a seminary in Rome. And his deputy was a Croatian priest named Krunoslav Dragonovic. So among those who were enabled to escape were, for example, Dinko Shakic, but also the head of state of the independent state of Croatia, one of the biggest mass murderers of World War II, someone who basically conducted 3 genocides. A genocide attempt to murder the Serbs, the Jews, and the Roma. So Dinko Shakic was among those who ran away to Argentina, and we were able to find him with the help of Jorge Camarasa, who's an Argentinian journalist. And to be honest, he wasn't really that hard to find because he wasn't hiding and he hadn't changed his name. But when he was discovered, I mean, this guy was totally, totally unrepentant. And when Camarasa went with a TV crew to interview him, he knocks on the door, and Shakic comes to the door, and Camarasa says to him, "No, you're Dinko Shakic." He says, "Yes." So Camarasa says, "You are the commandant of Jasenovac." He says, "Yes." Normally, when Nazi war criminals are about to be discovered or exposed, there's 2 answers. One is it's not me, mistaken identity, or it's me and I didn't do it. Dinko Shakic, it's me and I did it. And in the interview with him, he made it very clear that as far as he was concerned, there were no tortures in the Jasenovac. The mortality rate was the same as in any jail. It was only a penal colony. Every country had penal colonies. He said, if I were asked to do it again, I would do it. I sleep like a baby. I don't have any guilty conscience. It was the most horrific interview and the most shocking interview you could ever imagine. And we were very, very involved in getting him extradited to Croatia. And there was a big dilemma that we had because it wasn't clear where he should be put on trial. In other words, he could have been tried in Argentina, perhaps, in Israel, in Germany, or in the three countries in the Balkans of former Yugoslavia, because the camp itself was on the territory of Croatia and Bosnia, but the majority of the victims were Serbs. So I always say that if we were thinking only of the result, we would have hoped that the Serbs would have been able to extradite him, because within 5 minutes after being convicted, he'd be hanging from the highest tree in Belgrade. But our thinking always was that we want these trials to be held in the place where they're most needed. And there's no question that the people who needed the lesson of the crimes of Jasenovac and of Šakić himself personally were, of course, the Croatians, a country which many people are still sympathetic to the Ustasha. I think that they were great heroes. So we opted for Croatia. And another thing that was a problem was that the president of Croatia, the founding president of the democratic, new Croatia, was Franjo Tuđman, who had written a book. He considered himself a historian. He wrote a book called The Wastelands of Historical Reality. And he claimed that the Jews had inflated the number of victims of the Holocaust from 1 million to 6 million, and that the Jews ran Jasenovac. So, I mean, this is so absurd. I mean, it beggars description. But in any event, in the end, Croatia did seek his extradition, put him on trial, conducted the trial in a very good, respectable manner, and he was sentenced to the maximum sentence, which was 20 years, and he died in jail. But there was a lot of politics around the trial because they did not charge him with genocide. But they didn't charge Šakić with genocide. And that, of course, was a political decision. And ironically, or maybe not ironically, but to give you a feeling of what we were up against, I'll tell you two stories. One is that after Šakić was extradited to Zagreb, to Croatia, and was awaiting trial, this is the summer of '98, and Croatia was competing in the Mondial, the World Football Championship, and they were doing extremely, extremely well. And on the night of July 4th, 1998, the quarterfinals match, they faced Germany. And I remember I was in Zagreb, and during the first half, I was walking to the hotel where I wanted to see the game, and all of a sudden the earth shook. So I'm wondering, what happened? Is it an earthquake? Someone told me, no, Croatia just scored a goal against Germany. Then I went to see the end of the match, and they had beaten the Germans 3-0. It was probably the biggest upset ever in World Cup history. So I went out to see the celebrations. About 3 minutes after I'm walking out there with my kippah on my head, all of a sudden I see 7 young men marching towards me with a big, huge flag. I couldn't see if it was an Ustasha flag, that's the Croatian fascists, or the Croatian flag, which is very similar to the flag of the independent state of Croatia during World War II. In any event, they're yelling at the top of their lungs, Dinko Šakić, Dinko Šakić. Now, Dinko Šakić is in jail awaiting trial for mass murder. He didn't score the goals for Croatia against Germany. So that's what we were up against, of course.
My God.
And the other story is a very, very, I would say, poignant story. One of the testimonies in the case was that I think it was in April of '44, there was a breach of discipline in the camp, and Šakić immediately called the roll call. All the inmates had to appear in the central square lineup, and he was going up and down the rows, totally arbitrarily taking out people who were going to be hung in reprisal for the breach of discipline. So one of the people that he chose was a doctor from Montenegro. It's part of Yugoslavia. named Miller Boshkovitz. And he pointed to him, he took him out of the line, and Boshkovitz said to him, listen, I'm from Montenegro, and my tradition doesn't allow me to be hung. So Shakic on the spot took out his pistol and shot him in the head and murdered him. And at the end of the day of the verdict, as I'm walking out, I was approached by a very well-dressed gentleman who said to me, listen, I have only one word to say to you. What's the word? The word's hvala. Hvala in Croatian is thank you. Well, he said, without you, the trial never would have happened. But I had no idea who he was. So I asked someone, and he told me that that person was Miller Boshkovitz's brother. In other words, the brother of Shakic's victim. And I can promise you that he never dreamt that one day there would be an independent democratic Croatia, that country would put the great patriot, the great Ustasha, on trial, and he would get the maximum sentence. And this is something that Mr. Wiesenthal, Simon Wiesenthal, our mentor when it comes to hunting Nazis, always emphasized, which is the obligation we owe to the victims and their families to try and maximize justice and bring as many as possible of those responsible for turning innocent men, women, and children into victims, to bring them to trial and hopefully conviction and punishment.
What was that like for you to have the brother of a murdered man thank you for doing this?
It touched me. It's one of the most touching experiences I've ever had. And it's an experience that goes with me everywhere and is one of the sources of my consolation when, as often happens, unfortunately, let's say someone dies before it can be brought to justice. We had a case of a Nazi who was acquitted, totally unfairly acquitted, and things go wrong. And things very often go wrong because it's an uphill battle. And in many cases, countries don't want to prosecute. And the best way to explain it is to compare a 90-year-old Nazi to a serial killer. If a serial killer is on the loose in some normal country, the police will be on it and they'll do everything possible, because common wisdom is that these serial killers will continue to murder innocent people until they're put in jail. But what are the chances of a 90-year-old Nazi murdering someone? Well, it's never happened. So they know that all they have to do is ignore nudniks like me and other nudniks, and they'll spare themselves the expense, the embarrassment, and everything that goes along with it.
Let's go to a trial that's happening right now. Irmgard Furchner, a 96-year-old woman who worked as the secretary of Stutthof concentration camp in Nazi-occupied Poland, currently on trial in Germany after being accused of contributing to the deaths of 11,412 people between the years of 1943 and 1945. Her defense said that Furchner does not deny the crimes of the Shoah, neither does she deny the terrible acts that took place, as has once again been made clear to all of us in the indictment. She simply rejects the charge around which this trial ultimately revolves, that she was personally guilty of a crime. Dr. Zuroff, what do you make of this case and the defense's comments?
Okay, first of all, the case is very important, and I'm very proud and feel privileged that I was able to find survivors who can testify at this trial and at the other trial of Stutthof. This is not the first Stutthof trial, by the way. Last year, Bruno Day, who was a watchtower guard, was convicted. So first of all, it's a total lie, in my opinion. Her office was right not far from the gas chambers, and she signed off on every single document regarding the executions, regarding the shipment of prisoners to Auschwitz, and other things. So she's playing dumb, so to speak, which is hardly surprising. As a matter of fact, in her case, you know that she initially ran away on the day the trial was supposed to begin, having written a letter to the court 3 weeks earlier that she's sick and doesn't want to be made a laughingstock in front of all humanity. So I'm all in favor of these, what we call the belated trials. It's a result of the dramatic change in German prosecution policy, because until 13 years ago, if you wanted to prosecute a Nazi in Germany, you had to prove that that person had committed a specific crime against the specific victim and had done so motivated by racial hatred, which is practically impossible to prove, of course. And now the people are prosecuted based on service alone, which you can prove from documents. You don't need a witness to place the defendant at the scene of the crime. So, and this is a reminder, so right now there are two trials going on. One of a guard in Sachsenhausen that's going on in Brandenburg, and one in Itzehoe, north of Hamburg. That's the Fürstner trial. And in each case, this is a sort of history lesson about these two camps, which are known in Germany, or Sachsenhausen certainly, it's in Germany, but Stutthof was the first camp the Nazis built outside of the Third Reich, outside of Germany, and it's much less well known. 65,000 people were murdered there, 28,000 Jews. And it's an important reminder of the events of the camp, the terror of the camp, the crimes of the camp. And remember that you have a younger generation today who wasn't alive when Eichmann was brought to trial, when the Frankfurt trial of Auschwitz, people worked at Auschwitz, was held in Germany, and other trials, or 81, the Majdanek trial. So every generation needs its own reminders, and the passage of time in no way diminishes the guilt of the killers. And what people have to remember is, today they look old and frail, but when they committed these crimes, they were young people full of energy, and they devoted all their energy to murder innocent men, women, and children simply because they were Jews or other enemies of the Reich.
Yeah. And I think what's particularly interesting and unusual about the Fürstner case is that because she started working at the camp as an 18-year-old, she's now being tried in a juvenile court. I'm wondering, Dr. Zuroff, if she is found guilty, what do you think the likely sentence will be? And this also raises the question, can any sentence be remotely adequate for these crimes?
Okay, so there's no sentence that is adequate for these crimes. And the fact that they're being tried in juvenile court, she's not the first to be tried in a juvenile court. Bruno Day, the Stutthof guard who was convicted in July of 2020, he was sentenced to 2 years in prison, but he was given a suspended sentence, which it actually infuriated me. And I facetiously said that, okay, now let's find another concentration camp and put him in the concentration camp again so that he can commit the crime again so that the punishment can be applied, because a suspended sentence means you don't serve your sentence, but if you do it again, you do serve your sentence. So let's get him to do it again. I said it as a very bitter, facetious comment, but I have to say one thing about that trial. The verdict that was written by Judge Anne Maya Goring was absolutely brilliant refutation of all the arguments against these trials. In other words, the arguments that the defendants are old, that much time has passed, that more senior defendants, more senior officers were not brought to trial. Why should they be put to trial? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this year, every year, we put out a annual report on investigation and prosecution of Nazi war criminals. And I tell you the truth, I was so impressed by Anne Maya Goring's verdict that we published the entire verdict, because it was so convincing against all the arguments, like the small cog argument. And she explained there is no such thing as a small cog. It's these people who run the system, even if they're not officers, they're privates or corporals or whatever it is, or they didn't have military ranks. They're the ones who make this, in other words, help create the result that the Nazis wanted to achieve. So it was, in that respect, this trial produced an amazing document, amazingly convincing document, one that I think will stand the test of time.
Now, you also make a point of making a big distinction between Holocaust denial and Holocaust distortion. What, in your view, is this distinction? What is the difference here?
Okay, let's be very clear. It's actually quite simple. Holocaust denial is the denial that the Holocaust took place, or that the figures of the victims were grossly exaggerated. So in other words, if someone says that there were no gas chambers or gas chambers weren't used, there were only a couple 100,000 victims, all this is Holocaust denial. And the good news is that, at least in the Western world, for the most part, this fight has been won. Now, it's been won. For example, one of the very important milestones in the fight against Holocaust denial was the trial of David Irving. David Irving is perhaps the most dangerous Holocaust denier, because he started out as a legitimate historian, very charismatic. He's a very good speaker, and thanks to professors like Richard Evans from Cambridge and others, they simply tore his story to pieces. Okay, and they tore the narrative of denial to pieces. So that was a tremendous victory. That's not to say that no one in the West will ever deny the Shoah, but at the moment there's no serious historian or normative social or political group or party that promotes Holocaust denial. And distortion is a completely different issue. Distortion is to change the narrative of World War II. And it was not to deny that the Holocaust took place, but to change the narrative of how it took place and who was responsible for it. So this is a very serious phenomenon, especially in the new democracies of Eastern Europe. In other words, in post-communist Eastern Europe. Now, what you have to remember, there's a couple of things that are very important to remember. Which one is that only in Eastern Europe did collaboration with the Nazis include participation in systematic mass murder. In other words, the Nazis wanted to enlist local helpers in all of Europe that was either conquered by them or allied with them. So, except for the neutrals. In other words, the neutrals were Turkey, Switzerland, Sweden, Spain, Portugal, and Ireland. In those countries, everywhere else but those countries, the Holocaust did not take place. The Holocaust took place. Okay, now, the Nazis wanted to enlist these people for three reasons. One ideological reason and two practical reasons. The ideological reason was that they wanted to show that the local population supports the measures that they're taking against the quote-unquote enemies of the Reich, primarily Jews, but mentally ill, handicapped, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, Roma, communists, etc., etc. Okay, so but the practical reasons were, first of all, they're shorthanded. In other words, they ruled an area from the beaches of Normandy all the way to the gates of Leningrad and Moscow, Narvik and Trondheim in Norway down to the Greek islands. It's a huge landmass. So any local person that they could recruit helped them maintain their control, implement their programs of mass murder and persecution of mass murder. Now, the other point is this. They're coming to a country like Lithuania. They don't know the language. They don't know the geography. They don't know the topography. They are about to unleash an unprecedented mass murder operation, which initially started by shooting, not by death camps. As a matter of fact, the reason that they built places like Auschwitz as death camps was because the Himmler, who was the head of the SS, was worried about the negative effect on the shooters themselves. So they wanted a more impersonal method of mass murder. So in any event, how are they going to pull this off if the murders have to be carried out individually? So again, let's take a country like Lithuania. There were 220,000 Jews living under the Nazi occupation, of whom 212,000 were murdered. That's 96.4%. Every single one of these Jews had to be murdered individually, because 90% of them were murdered by shooting, and only at the end of the war were some of the people sent to concentration camps. Okay, so you need people to arrest the Jews, guard the Jews until a proper mass murder site can be found. Then shoot every single one of them individually. In some cases, they smashed the heads of the babies instead of shooting them, in typical Nazi cruelty fashion and Lithuanian cruelty fashion. And then they could cover the grave, and then they could distribute the property, steal the property and the valuables and all of that. So, but the thing is that in Lithuania, during the Nazi occupation, there were less than 1,000 Germans there. So how on earth could they pull this thing off to the extent that they did? Of 212,000 Jews, plus not to mention the more than 5,000 Jews from Germany, Austria, and France brought to Lithuania also to be murdered. And the Lithuanians also sent a unit to Belarus to kill Jews. So little Lithuania was responsible for almost 250,000 Jews, most of whom were killed by shooting. And the number of Germans was very small, but you had more than 20,000 Lithuanians who were helping. So this is the problem that faces these countries. Their narrative is one of horrible things that they themselves did. So what they're trying to do, these people who are distorting the Holocaust, is one, hide or minimize the role of the local collaborators. So in other words, when you, in Lithuania, for example, when they talk about the Holocaust, they said, oh, that's when the Germans came to our country and murdered our Jews. Is that true? There's a kernel of truth to it, because without the Germans and Austrians, there wouldn't have been a Holocaust. But once it came, they could never have done what they did to that scope without the help of the local killers, okay? So I remember when I was invited in 1991 to a dedication of a monument in Vilna, at Ponar, to the site of the mass murder of the Jews of Vilna. So the keynote speaker was the Prime Minister of Lithuania. And this is 91, okay? So you already said at that point, all of this took place in the eye blink, something like 3 months. Everyone's turning around. What 3 months? It was 3 years in Lithuania, 41 to 44. And then he says, the misdeeds of a few misfits, degenerates, cannot besmirch the reputation of a country that did so much to help its Jewish neighbors. Gott in Himmel. I mean, God Almighty. What kind of lies can you tell, right? Yeah. So that's one thing. The second thing is that they're promoting the canard of equivalency between communist crimes, which they're insisting is genocide, and Nazi crimes. Why? First of all, they want to deflect the attention to their own crimes. They want to get sympathy for their suffering. And if communist crimes are genocide, that means the Jews committed genocide. Whoa, 1 second. If Jews committed genocide, so how can they complain about what we did or didn't do, or claim that they didn't do? Because if everyone's guilty, nobody's guilty. Number three, these countries need new heroes, the new democracies. Who are the heroes? The ones who fought against the communists after World War II. Well, but the problem is that some of those people murdered Jews during the Shoah, which in theory should disqualify them. How can someone be a national hero if he murdered his innocent neighbors? And we see this all over. In Lithuania, in Latvia, in Estonia, in Croatia, in Hungary, the heroes sometimes are people who under no circumstances should be glorified. And the fourth point is that they're working to establish a joint Memorial Day for all the victims of totalitarian regimes. In other words, communism and Nazism. Oh, wonderful. You understand? What day did they choose? August 23rd. What happened on August 23rd, 1939? The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which paved the way for World War II. So in other words, they're saying, You, innocent observer, think that the Third Reich bears the sole responsibility for the 50 million people killed during World War II? Think again. The Soviets made it possible. So, in other words, they're comparing the country that conceived, planned, built, and ran the biggest mass murder factory in world history ever, Auschwitz-Birkenau, with a country with all its flaws, and I don't want to in any way minimize communist crimes, whose army liberated Auschwitz and stopped the mass murder. So these are the problems, and in my book that I wrote with Ruta Venegaita, a Lithuanian author who discovered that her family was involved in killing Jews, we go from place to place, from 40 places of mass murder, to speak to survivors, not survivors, to speak to eyewitnesses, all non-Jews. And invariably we ask who carried out the murders. And every single one said the same thing, the Lithuanians.
Well, you've very helpfully described the difference between denial and distortion. I want to get onto the modern appropriation of Holocaust imagery now. Now, throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen the appropriation of Nazi-era symbols, particularly anti-vaccination protesters wearing the yellow Star of David badge forced upon Jews during the Holocaust. And this is not one or two people doing this. This is a lot. Like in Berlin, for example, this has become such a prominent feature that of demonstrations that police have been given the authority now to intervene when they see people wearing the star. Would you class this as a form of Holocaust revisionism? And were you surprised to see this trend crop up over the past 2 years?
First of all, it's not Holocaust revisionism. It's Holocaust trivialization. In other words, to, in a sense, turn the Holocaust into a far more trivial event than it was in fact. Now, it's very ironic, but in a certain sense, I have to say that there's a small silver lining here, which goes to prove the success of the people who have devoted their lives to promoting Holocaust education, Holocaust research, Holocaust commemoration. In other words, the Holocaust has become the ultimate tragedy. And that's why everyone who has a cause wants to connect that cause or to claim that it is similar to the Holocaust, related to the Holocaust, because that's the most effective tool. But it's a horrible thing because it basically turns the Holocaust into something, much, much more minor than it actually was.
Yeah. I'm just wondering, has social media played a part in your work, helping and hindering your work, catching Nazis?
First of all, it's helped me because I found many potential witnesses through Facebook and Twitter. We do historical research, but I also post on Facebook that the Simon Wiesenthal Center is looking for survivors of Camp X or Y who were in the camp from this date to that date and and are willing to possibly, potentially testify or help in some way. So, for example, I found two survivors in Britain from Stuttgart, but unfortunately, they were not so cooperative. Which was quite strange because in many cases, most of the people want to be cooperative. So,
do you think that's just they don't want to sort of relive that experience?
It's hard to say. I don't know. They've spoken about their experiences. I know in the past, and they've also done some things to help teach about it. But
yeah.
It's not clear why. I mean, I don't know them personally, so I don't want to say anything, and I don't want to criticize them. But it's a fact. I mean, we do occasionally encounter, reluctance to come forward.
Yeah, yeah. Dr. Zuroff, I really want to thank you for giving us your time. Before we wrap up, I want to ask you, where can people find more about you and what you do, and what have you got coming up?
My book, Our People, Discovering Lithuania's Hidden Holocaust, which is the book that I wrote with Ruta Venegaita. who a very well-known Lithuanian author, one of the most popular authors in Lithuania, who discovered that her relatives, her grandfather and her aunt's husband, were involved in persecution and murder of Jews, and she wanted to atone for it. And we went together to 40 places of mass murder where Lithuanians murdered Jews, most of them in Lithuania, a few in Belarus, where a Lithuanian unit was sent to murder the Jews. And a book that made an enormous scandal in Lithuania because it also exposed the lies of the government. Half of the book is research that Ruta did in the special KGB archives about the political leadership of Lithuania, the local administration, which came back to serve the Nazis after being fired by the Soviets, and the killing squads. So the book really had a real impact. The head of national security in Lithuania actually went on national television and said that the book is a threat to Lithuanian national security. The American embassy actually had to tell them to calm down and get a life. But so that's one book that I think is very, very timely and very important. It's a book, labor of love, I would say, a monument, in my case, to my great uncle, Rabbi Efraim Zuroff, who was murdered by the Lithuanians on July 13th, 1941. And another book is Operation Last Chance, One Man's Quest to Bring Nazi Criminals to Justice, which is all about Nazi hunting and my story, how I became a Nazi hunter. And it's a little more complicated than what I said on this podcast. But in any event, and a lot about the cases that I dealt with. And those of you who are interested in more specialized research, I wrote a book called The Response of Orthodox Jewry in the United States to the Holocaust, and it's about the history of the Vad Hatzalah, the Rabbinical Rescue Committee established by Orthodox rabbis in the United States, initially to save only rabbis and yeshiva students, and later to save all Jews. Fascinating story that has to do with rescue priority during the Holocaust. Do you break American laws if they hinder rescue, for example, and all sorts of things of that sort. Of course, I'm totally objective about this, you understand, but it really does deal with interesting questions. When did the people know about the Holocaust? What did they know? And very important questions in trying to assess the response of the Jewish communities outside of Europe.
And where can people find you and the Simon Wiesenthal Center if they want to find out more online?
Okay, first of all, I would really be very pleased if you would follow me on Twitter. So my tag is at capital E, capital Z, UROFF. Okay, so I report on all our activities. Just in the last 2 weeks, we had 2 victories, which are quite interesting, I have to tell you. In one case, we learned that there was a project being supported by the European Union and by the UN Development Program to renovate the home of a notorious Albanian Nazi collaborator in Mitrovica in Kosovo. And I wrote to the EU ambassador to Israel. I wrote to the EU commissioner on combating anti-Semitism. And we actually got it stopped, which was quite amazing. And I'm very proud of that. And in Austria, we learned that in the state of Carinthia, the person who was appointed director of the Office for the Protection of the Constitution and Combating Terrorism actually had participated several times in extreme right-wing events, and had even addressed the crowd in one of them. So we immediately wrote to the Austrian ambassador, and I was interviewed in the Austrian media, and I said what a scandal this was. And sure enough, he's been replaced. He's been dismissed from that post. So this is just in the last 2 weeks. But at least I
Right.
can tell you about some successes. It's not always successes in this work.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Zuroff, for your time. Thank you for joining Podcast Against Antisemitism.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.